Glad to be with you in person this time. The last few times I've spoken with you, it's been virtually, and it's been a very different experience. So glad to be with you. If you don't know me, my name is Steve Bishop. I've been a longtime friend of Josh and a longtime friend of CCMC as well. So glad to be with you again. I wanted to start out by just sharing something, and that is that some people really drive me crazy. I don't know if you've ever had this happen to you, but have you ever had someone you've been stuck behind someone who was driving 5 to 10 miles below the speed limit when you were on your way to something very important and you were already running behind and you just happen to get right behind this wrong vehicle. And it never seems to happen when you're on a road that you could easily turn off or you could easily pass someone. It never happens on those roads. It's always the single road, or it's always the road that's filled with traffic that you find. And instead, you're often stuck behind those people when there's no hope of passing. And it's almost never happens. It's almost always happens, I find, when I've just recently, in the last intersection, let them go before me. I could have just gotten in, aggressively gone in front of them, but I didn't. And so what do? I kindly let them go in front of me. And what do they do in return? But they drive as slow as possible. And so I find myself, daydreaming about what it would have been like if I had just gotten in front of them, if I had just made that turn before them. Those people deeply frustrate me. But they aren't as bad to me as those people who illegally park in the middle of the street. They throw on their hazard lights and then they just somehow disappear. I don't know if this has ever happened to you or not, but nothing raises my blood pressure like turning on a one-way street and immediately being confronted with those flashing lights up ahead. There's no way around. I can't back up. I just have to sit there patiently and wait, because amazingly, this person is nowhere in sight. And so I just have to sit there and wait. And somehow in Chicago, some people are under the impression that as long as you turn on your hazard lights, you can just park anywhere you want. It doesn't really matter if it's a spot. And those people really get under my skin. And I wonder who those people are for you. Maybe it's the person who only responds to half of your email. You take the time to craft this well-written response to an email, and it includes a couple questions, yet their response, for some reason, only includes a few words, and those few words don't seem to be answering any of the questions that you just asked them. Those people really irk me too, and perhaps it's the person who always tries to one-up you. I don't know if you've ever had anybody like this in your life, but I don't know if you've ever met someone who has this propensity to just share their one-up story compared to you share with them about how you have just gotten back from this amazing trip to California, and they respond, "Yeah, awesome, that's so great. I just got back from Hawaii." "Oh, thank you." Or you share with them about how you earned this amazing promotion at work, and they respond not with congratulations, but by explaining how they've made it all the way up the corporate ladder so many years ago. That's old news to them. Those people make me really mad. And don't you just wish sometimes that you could call those people out? Don't you wish you could just roll down your window and just give them a rundown of all the ways that their behavior has just inconvenienced you? Don't you wish you could just let them have it, to just kind of empty your frustrations out on them? Well, in the section of Luke's gospel that we're going to look at today, we just read, Jesus is going to call out some people. He's not going to berate them or lose his temper with them. He's not going to provide a long discourse on their evils. Instead, he's going to utilize a powerful tool that's much more subtle and much more effective. The tool is called a parable. And as we explore this section, I really want us to focus on really just two things. First is the audience. Who were these people that Jesus was trying to call out? And then two, the parable itself. What is he trying to communicate to them? And so before we jump into that, let me just take another minute to pray for us. God, thank you for another opportunity to think about and to learn from your word. I pray that you would be with us this morning. I pray that your presence would be here, that you would speak through me, that you would speak to us, that you would change our hearts, that you would make us more like you, God. I thank you for this passage of scripture. I thank you for what it teaches us about you. And I pray that you would work it deep into our hearts this morning. In Jesus' name, amen. Well, first, we're going to see who were these people that seemed to be irking Jesus. And maybe irking isn't the right word, but if I were the judge, the people irking me would probably be those who do horrible, terrible things, the people who make a mockery of my laws, the people you hear about on the news, the person who robs the elderly woman at gunpoint and before running off knocks her out, right? Those are the people who would irk me as the ultimate judge, or the person who's been inappropriately interacting with women at work and abusing his power. But Jesus never seems to be as concerned about the moral failings of others as we are. Instead of addressing those people, we're told in verse 9 that he told this parable to some people who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and trusted others and treated others with contempt. The people Jesus is concerned about in this section are those people who are self-righteous, the people who think they have it all figured out. They're the people who work really, really hard to be good people, the people who think their behavior is much greater than their bad behavior, and as a result, they should be applauded. But it's not just the self-righteous person, it's the self-righteous person who also treats others with contempt. It's the person who looks down on those whose lives are messy. It's the people who look out on the landscape of the world and use everyone else's behavior as their standard. They look out and they recognize there are a lot of messed up people out there. And they recognize that there are a lot of sinners out there, but in comparison, they're doing so much better. They don't steal from the Salvation Army bucket. They don't commit tax fraud or swindle people out of millions of dollars. And they certainly would never associate with anyone who does. Those people aren't worth their time. And friends, I wonder today if you would put yourself in that sort of category. I wonder if you've ever found yourself thinking of your behavior as so much better than other people. Well, in order to address these people, Jesus isn't going to go on a long tirade. He's not going to send out nasty little tweets. He's not even going to go on to cable news networks and talk about how terrible all these people are. Instead, he's simply going to share a parable. And if you aren't familiar with this literary device, you might assume a parable is something like a fable. Now, I love fables, and I especially love Aesop's fables. And I love reading about how the tortoise slowly and steadily beats the hare in a race, right? I love the lessons that we learn from them. But a parable is not a fable. A parable is so much more. A parable is often told in Scripture to help someone see themselves in a different way. It's a sneaky device. You listen to the story, you get captivated by the characters, and usually you find yourself in it, and then suddenly you're confronted with the hard truth about yourself or about the world. A parable is meant to shake you up a little bit, and it helps you see yourself and the world in a different way. And parables, I think so often they take you where you don't really want to go, and they expose things that you don't really want exposed. And this one is no different. The parable begins in verse 10 by introducing us to two people who have gone into the temple to pray. And these two characters are very different from one another. One is a Pharisee and one is a tax collector. And Pharisees were the spiritual giants of the day. They were the most influential of all the Jewish leaders. They were respected by all, and they developed a reputation for being the holiest of the holy. They were the people in society that everyone else looked up to and admired. And so if you were a parent, was coaching a child about their behavior, and they would point them to the Pharisees. If you were a young Jewish boy, you would very likely have worshiped these men. When I was just a little guy, I worshiped my cousin, whose name also happened to be Steve. And he was a football star, and he had lots of cool friends, and he was very successful. And ever since I can remember, I've always wanted to follow in his footsteps. And for the longest time, I even wanted to pursue the same vocation. And Pharisees were role models like that of the day. Everyone wanted to be like them. They did amazing things. They were honorable men. They worked hard to practice their religion and to live upright lives. But in contrast to the Pharisee, we're told that there was also this tax collector who happened to be present in the temple praying. And tax collectors were the opposite, right? They were the scum of the earth. They were the people everyone looked down on. They were the people that when you were walking down the street and you saw a tax collector up ahead, you would do your best to avoid eye contact and avoid interacting with them unless you were really forced to. And if you were in the crowd overhearing this parable, you would have been disgusted at the presence of the tax collector in the story. Tax collectors were traitors. They were corrupt businessmen. They took advantage of people and situations for their own gain. And so they developed a reputation for being the worst of the worst. And no one wanted their children to grow up and enter into the tax collecting business, right? It was an organization that was built on corruption. And it was very difficult to be an honest tax collector. And so I imagine if a child had come up to their parents during this time and they declared they were going to be a tax collector when they grew up, their mother would have probably fainted, and their father probably would have gone into a long, angry 10-minute lecture on pursuing a career that's beneficial to the world and would glorify God. And so as we enter into this parable, we find these two very different men, one despised and one celebrated, coming into the temple to pray. And as we overhear their prayers, we discover that these two very different men express two very different prayers to God. We see the Pharisee's prayer first in verses 11 and 12. He prays, God, I thank you that I am not like other men, extortioners, unjust adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. And his prayer, it begins somewhat reasonably by thanking God, right? That's always a great place to start when you're praying. But very quickly, this prayer starts to get a little disturbing. He thanks God, not for all the provisions and blessings he has in his life. He doesn't thank God for all the amazing opportunities and resources he's had access to all of his life. Instead, he thanks God for what he's not. He thanks God that he's not like those people, other bad, messy, broken people. He thanks God that his life isn't characterized by all this bad stuff. Instead, it's characterized by rigorous discipline. He goes above and beyond all the expectations spelled out in the Jewish law. He fasts not once, but twice a week. And he gives not just a tithe, but above and beyond a tithe. He's always giving back, and he's working hard to live a righteous life. And as you overhear it, you can't help but pick up on the self-centeredness of it, right? He says I 5 times and only really mentions God in passing. It's all about him and his achievements and how good he is. And you can't help but imagine that the volume of the prayer is a little louder than it probably needs to be, right? He's not simply saying this prayer to communicate to God. He's saying it to show off to others. He's saying, look how awesome I am. And as you listen to it, you must also imagine that he's probably going on and on and on. He's rambling. He's doing one of those lofty speech/prayers that's sort of disguised as just a simple prayer. He's using all the fancy words. It's no doubt a polished prayer here. It's characterized with all the buzzwords. He's an impressive prayer, and no doubt he's praying with zeal and gusto and using King James Version language. And as his audience overheard this Pharisee's prayer, they likely would have seen through it, right? They would have noticed his arrogance and they would have picked up on his conceit. But more than likely, they still would have had a favorable response towards him. More than likely, they still would have held him in high regard. After all, he was saying all these things about himself. All the things that he was saying was true. He was as good as he was bragging about. I imagine that the audience here that Jesus is speaking to, their reaction likely would have been similar to how we react to professional athletes after they make a big play and participate in that wonderful expression of pride that we call showboating. Right? It's something, especially in the NFL, that you see almost after every big play. A sequence of events is almost predictable, right? The player intercepts the ball from their opponent. They dodge in and out of other players, and they run all the way down the field and score a touchdown. And then as soon as they get in the end zone, what do? Right? They start doing a little dance, throwing up some number 1 signs, and look how awesome I am, right? And they are. They're competing at a level that very few people can compete at. And so we let them get away with this sort of ridiculous display of pride, and we cheer them on. Yeah, right? And that's likely how this audience would have responded. Yeah, it's a little inappropriate, but they're incredibly religious. And so it's hard not to show off once in a while, right? Well, in contrast to the Pharisees, the tax collector's prayer is much different. Instead of standing in a place of prominence so everyone can see and hear him, he's standing far off. He's standing in the back. And I'm a big college football fan, and my favorite team is the Ohio State Buckeyes. If you know anything about the Buckeyes, you know that their biggest rival is the Michigan Wolverines. And there is so much animosity towards among these teams, and especially among the fans of the two teams. So it's always a surprise to me when I see fans of the opposing team show up at the stadium. If you're an OSU fan and you see a Michigan fan creep in, you do your best to make them feel uncomfortable. That's like part of the job. You give them dirty looks, or you chant "Go Bucks" obnoxiously in their face, and you do anything that you can to make them feel unwanted in these parts. And the same is true in Michigan Stadium. And so it's very likely that this tax collector would have experienced something similar when he tried to make his way into this temple. He wasn't wanted there. He wasn't welcome. And so he came in to meet with God, but he knew his place. He didn't think he was worthy to be there, so he stood in the back. And as he stood there praying, he wasn't concerned about others hearing him. He couldn't even muster the courage to lift up his eyes towards heaven. And this unwillingness to look up towards the heaven, it was a sign of shame. He's ashamed of himself. He's ashamed of his lifestyle. He feels the weight of his brokenness, and this is made even more apparent when we witness his physical reaction. You know, instead of doing a celebratory dance in the end zone, it says he's beating his breast as a sign of contrition and frustration over what his life has become. He's not going on and on with lofty words. He doesn't even have the words to say. So he just beats his chest. And as he's beating his chest, he's not subtly sharing with God all the ways he's succeeded in his religious life. He's simply crying out to God for mercy. He says, "God, be merciful to me, a sinner." And you can feel the emotion and remorse just leaking out of him. He's come to the realization that he is as bad as everyone says. He knows he's been taking advantage of people. He knows he's not lived up to the righteous expectations of his community, let alone the expectations of God. And so he cries out and he pleads for mercy. He knows that's his only hope. His religious resume is pathetic, especially compared to this Pharisee. And as we witness this prayer, we can't help but feel sympathy towards him. He's a real mess. He's clearly come to the end of himself and feels the weight of his sin. But it's very unlikely that any of Jesus' audience would have felt the same way, the same empathy. It's more likely that the audience would have responded the way we respond when we see someone get what they deserve, right? When we often rejoice when we read about the latest politician who finally got caught abusing his power, and now he's standing before a judge and he's crying his eyes out and asking him not to punish him. And so we get excited. We experience great joy sometimes when we see that. We often experience great joy when we see that bully, right, who's terrorized kids on the playground, finally get sent to the principal's office, and he just cries his eyes out as he's being given his consequence. And we think, finally, he's getting what he deserves. Jewish people would have had a very hard time extending any sort of sympathy towards this character. Tax collectors had been the source of so much pain and so much trauma for them. Tax collectors had abused them and their families. They had taken advantage of them and stolen their money. And as far as they were concerned, they could just go to hell. And so as Jesus continues his parable, I imagine that the audience is beginning to play out in their minds and anticipate how he's going to sort of wrap this up. I imagine they're hoping he'll pronounce judgment on this nasty tax collector so they can finally witness him getting what he deserves, even if it's just fiction. I'll bet some of them are dreaming that he'll mock him or make fun of him, but I don't think any of them anticipated this conclusion. Now, after Jesus introduces these people and describes their prayers, he goes on to make a shocking pronouncement in verse 14. Jesus says, I tell you, this man, the tax collector, went down to his house justified rather than the other. And when they hear Jesus make this pronouncement, I'll bet the audience began to react in all sorts of ways, but I bet all of them were shocked. How could Jesus even insinuate that this tax collector could be pleasing to God, could be right with God? It went against everything they had understood about their religion and about how people become right with God. They didn't have categories for this type of situation. If there was anyone who should not be right before God, it's this guy. But that's not even the worst of it. Jesus isn't just saying that this corrupt tax collector is right before God. He's also saying that this admirable Pharisee is not justified before God. If there was anyone who they thought ought to be right before God, it would be him. But that isn't how it works in the kingdom of God. The people who enter into the kingdom of God are those who recognize that they shouldn't be let in, that they don't make the cut. They recognize that they are sinners and they cry out for God's mercy. Friends, you can't earn God's favor on your own. You can't become justified based on your own activity. The only way for you and I to become justified is by depending on the mercy of God and placing our trust in Jesus. It's justification by faith alone. Because verse 14, everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. This parable serves as a reminder that our relationship with God is not based on our goodness or our badness. It's based on God's grace and mercy. It's a reminder that none of us are too good to be exempt from our need of God's mercy, and none of us are too bad to be disqualified from God's mercy. And so as we're confronted by Jesus' powerful words this morning, I think it serves as a warning for us, especially those of us who've been following Jesus for a very long time. When you've been a Christian for a while and you commit yourself to growing into the image of Jesus and you work hard to live a righteous, respectable life, there's a danger that you'll begin to think of yourself more highly than you ought. As you begin to repair your life and as you begin to find wholeness, it can sometimes get challenging to admit that we're still broken, that we're still ultimately sinners. I think all of us have this propensity to magnify our good stuff and minimize our bad stuff. And as we do, we can slowly and subtly begin to forget that the only reason we're able to be in a relationship with Jesus is because of God's great mercy. We can slowly and subtly begin to embrace the lie that we are entitled to God's presence and that we've earned God's approval. And you know that you're doing it. You know that this is happening to you when you start looking down on others because of their poor performance. You'll start sounding like this Pharisee. I thank God that I'm not like those people. But friends, make no mistake about it. We are all sinners and we are all hopeless without the grace and mercy of God. Even the best of us still falls short. Even those of us who think we have it all figured out don't really have it all figured out. And so do everything that you can to be honest about who you really are. Don't allow your good works to blind you to what is ultimately true. None of us will ever outgrow our need for God's mercy and grace. But not only is this a warning to us, I think it also serves as a source of encouragement for us. As we consider the tax collector, who was the worst of the worst, we're reminded that our relationship with God is not ultimately based on our behavior. It's not contingent on our performance. And that is such a gift. We are reminded that we can't screw it up. Friends, none of your mistakes or mess-ups or failures exclude you from entry into God's kingdom. Nothing you do can make God love you any less. And so I wonder this morning, what is it that you're struggling with today? Maybe some of you find yourself in a place similar to that of the tax collector. in a place where you think or feel like you're too bad for the gospel. Maybe your past is filled with mistakes and failures, and you wonder, how could I ever be pleasing to God? Be encouraged this morning. God loves you regardless of your mistakes or mess-ups. Maybe others of you find yourself in a place similar to that of the Pharisee, in a place where you're having a harder time seeing your need for God's mercy. Allow this parable to serve as a warning to you that you aren't as good as you think you are. Allow it to remind you that just like this tax collector, we are desperately in need of his grace and mercy. And allow it to free you from the burden of feeling like you have to earn God's favor. Friends, we already have God's favor. God loves us all. And so live in that this morning. Let's pray. God, thank